We're joined by Professor Olaseni Akintola-Bello from Abuja Studios, who is a public finance analyst and a budget expert. More than that, thank you for joining us this morning, Professor. I mean, 6 months, some say 7, down the line, we're still talking about the 2013 budget, which, by the way, we seem to have forgotten it was presented, in fact, passed in 2012, December 2012, and all of the expectation was up, but now look at where we still are. In terms of how the House of Reps has thrown out this budget, do you think this causes any hitch to the passage of the budget, and how so?
Well, in the Constitution, the President is expected to seek for additional funds if there is need for that, but there is a process for doing that, and I think what we should really do is to find out whether we have in place what we call the budget management law, which is quite different from the Appropriation Act. The budget management law tells us what should be done at each stage when the budget is being presented. It also, of course, makes provision for the President to develop, should the need arise, a supplementary budget, which he needs to send to the House for passage. I think that before, the system we had was that people spend money and later on seek a supplementary budget approval. But what the House of Representatives, what they are saying now is that even before you can spend money, or you need to get an approval. And I think I heard the gentleman say that what the President is asking for is also the same as, is also equal or more than the budget itself. I think it comes down to the budget management process. I think there should have been some sort of discussion between the executive and the Parliament before this appropriation or the supplementary budget was sent. And of course, the supplementary budget should be looked at, reasonably by the House. And it is assumed that if it's not unreasonable, the request is not unreasonable, it should be passed, barring politics.
Okay, Prof. But how do they go about requesting for supplementary budget where people are asking, what's even going on with the one passed? Has anything been done with respect to implementation? And why would they assent to 2013 budget if it cannot be implemented as passed?
Well, when the budget is being put together, there are certain assumptions that were made. And those budgets were made on the assumptions that prices will be this, the economic situation will be that, the social situation will be assumed. And if those assumptions are okay, then what has been passed in the budget can be implemented. But down the line, situations can change. Economic situations can change. The prices assumed in putting together the budget can change. And new developments can also happen. For example, look at the security situation. An emergency situation or an emergency has been declared in certain states as a result of the security situation. This was not envisaged originally in the budget. So additional funds must be provided in order to be able to enable the executive to implement or carry out these activities. And you remember that the activity was sent to the House for discussion and was passed that, okay, we agree with this emergency problem. But they will still need money. The executive will need money to execute the emergency situation. There might be other problems, economic and social, that might have arisen before the budget was passed or after the budget has been passed. So it is perhaps very important for the executive to want to address some of these problems. But I think it also comes down to a problem of negotiation between the executive and the assembly. If we have a proper management law in place, that such procedures should have been accommodated when you are requesting for supplementary budget. Again, let us assume that the budget follows international best practices, because if it does, we should have provisions in the budget for what we call reserves, revenue reserves, and or contingency reserves. Unless the situation has actually consumed, or the funds required exceeded the amount put in the reserves, that will give rise to a supplementary budget. In fact, generally, one of the international best practices is to discourage this supplementary, bringing up supplementary budget.
Yeah, but Prof, the thing
and that was why it was said in the new budget process.
Yeah, but in the first
which most countries now adopt.
They even say
they always make sure that they make provisions for reserves, revenue reserves,
at the
and
moment,
contingency
Prof,
reserves.
if you can hear, what is going on here is that the House of Reps are saying, well, this is not even a supplementary budget as the executive has presented it. They titled it 2013, I'm trying to see what was written here, Appropriation Act 2013 Amendment Bill. So it looks as if, from what the House of Reps are saying here, is that they're seeking to amend a budget that has already been passed and assented to by the President. And they think this is not recognized by law. If you need more funds, you present a supplementary budget. And then you have people asking, where did this even come from, and how could the executive have come up with an amendment to an already passed budget, not presenting a supplementary budget?
Well, it comes down to what I've said. If there is a budget management law in Nigeria, which we don't have, things like that should have been envisaged, that the budget passed or the Appropriation Act, they can give provision, make allowances for amendments of those acts. What are the amendments that are being sought by the executives? They will come down to some of the items of expenditures or items of activities that were earlier approved in the Appropriation Act. We can see the Constitution is being amended now. So the Appropriation Act should also be subject to amendment. But I would say that the House, they are right to say that if you need additional money, ask for supplementary budget. Fine. So the President can take a cue from that and present a supplementary budget for consideration of the House. But as I've said, again, it comes down to the issue of governance consultations between the executive and the legislature. If there is enough understanding, all these things will have been trashed out. It will not have been done in a sort of, okay, we want to seek amendment to the Appropriation Act. And I think that the whole budget management process needs to be reworked. And I think also that the legislature should try and bring up as soon as possible their own legislative budget division. Because if they have a legislative budget research department and they confer, and the executive, the budget office of the Federation confer with the legislature's budget office, all these issues can be ironed out, and the legislature can be appropriately informed as to why certain amendments have to be made in the budget already passed. But as it is now, we can also say to the executive that, okay, fine, let sleeping dogs lie, let present a supplementary budget if indeed you need an additional money, which is what should happen. But as I've said, generally, there is a general trend towards discouraging executives from bringing about supplementary budget after the main budget has been passed. Maybe that was what informed the executive to want to seek amendment to the Appropriation Act. But if it's not to the liking of the legislature, well, we then go back and then prepare a supplementary budget. But as I've said, there's a need for a legislative budget office and to liaise very well and constantly with the budget office of the Federation or the executive, so that all these issues can be ironed out, and the legislative budget office can now inform the legislature about what has been happening and the agreement they have reached. So as it is now, it appears as if the legislature at times, they may not have adequate information on which they base their objections, and they may, but we don't know. But all these things, and I think it's also from the past, the budget is no longer a black box. The executive should know that, the legislature should know that too. It should be open to everybody, even to people like us, the public. The president wants to seek this so and so, and I'm not too sure many people have even seen the content of the amendment which the executive is seeking.
Do you think, Prof, that
so
the Finance Department should also be involved in legalese, because it would seem that this was actually thrown out on the point of law in saying that the Constitution does not recognize an amendment, it only recognizes a supplementary budget.
Yeah, if they don't, we are still saying the same thing. If we have a budget management law, which we don't, what we are talking about in the Constitution is just how budget should be made and passed. But most countries have a budget, what we call a budget management law, aside from what you have in the Constitution, a step-by-step procedure of what should happen. And this budget management law will have accommodated changes in the Appropriation Act. If the Constitution does not accommodate it, well, it has been thrown up. Maybe it is now time for an executive-sponsored bill to have what we call a budget management law. Just as for example, a budget management law will accommodate something like a legislative budget office, which we have in the U.S. too, the Congressional Budget Office. And they have all sorts of information. In fact, they are in a position to prepare what you can call alternative budget. So when the president proposes a budget, the Congressional Budget Office can now look at it and compare it with the information and the data they have, and then advise the Congress appropriately. So throwing out, if the president's request is reasonable, I think we should look at it in that sense. Not on the point of law, but look at it, okay, we will not allow this, but this is what we should do. Look at when we had a problem with the president's sickness during Yar'Adua's situation, the legislature came out with certain sort of rationale for passing some laws to allow the vice president to take over the mantle of leadership. So things like that, such sort of rapport, if there's a good rapport between the legislature and the executive, should have allowed the amendment to the Appropriation Act with a caution to the president that, look, we are just doing this in order not to frustrate the intentions of the president and to ensure that the budget is implemented. Now, the question we should be asking ourselves, are the requests of the president, are they reasonable? Or are they not reasonable? Or are they not required? Are the economic, social, and political situations, do they justify the additional request for money? If they do, the legislature will look at it reasonably. But as I've said, this is a question of governance, a lot of negotiation. That's what we call budgetary politics. The president should play the budgetary politics with the executive. All right? You have to meet the legislature and the executive through your representatives and iron out all these areas of differences. Perhaps if they have done that, the legislature will have advised the president or the executive, we cannot pass it as it is. Can you please present a supplementary budget? Rather than having to wait, then talk about it in the House and then throw it out and say, we are not amending it, send us a supplementary budget. All these things will have been ironed out.
So you do not think that it was sufficient, that based on just the title, to which some members raised objections, so much so that they had to constitute a committee to look at that particular objection, you do not think that it was sufficient enough? You think that somehow they should have found a way to go beyond it, to look at the contents of what the amendment was about and see how they could have done it in-house? Is that what you're suggesting, sir?
Yeah, politics, as I've said, is the art of the possible. As we've said now, the committee they set up may not have been necessary if we have a legislative budget office. The legislative budget office will have advised or provided enough or sufficient information to the committee, which the committee will now take back to the sitting of the whole House. We don't know. Nobody knows the nitty-gritty of the decisions of the information or the data available to the legislative committee before they arrive at their decision. But they are representatives of the people. They have a right to decide, and they have a right to also act in the best interest of the country. The president also is a representative of the people. He also has a right to want to implement certain things. So we cannot have a sort of a conflict perpetually. The conflicts can be sorted out, and as I've said, we should not decide everything on the points of law always. There should be, a gentleman was talking about conventions and tradition. I think you asked the question tradition. There should be convention. Over time, we build up practices and it becomes convention. And those are the things not everything should be written down in black and white. And in any case, law cannot be completely specified. There will be some gray areas that will still be left out. So we should give room for traditions and conventions to develop. You yourself asked that question. Is there no need for tradition? And that is why, if you look at the British Constitution, part of it is more of convention, not written. It's part of it's handed down as a result of practices, agreements, and conventions, and concessions, and what have you. So, and another thing that even under the presidential system, there should be room for that type of convention to develop over time. Okay. We should not look at it from the point of law always.
All right, I haven't talked about the fact that we need a budget management law, and then you talked about the budget drafting process. So, at what stage will the drafting of the budget come in? Because, again, the process of drafting it also raises a lot of questions, which you've talked about time and again. So while considering this budget management law, if they will, where should the drafting process come in?
Well, okay, the budget management law is an all-embracing law. In fact, it should happen not only at the federal, but also at the state level too, because we have executive as well as assemblies. So right from the Ministry of Finance sending us a budget circular to all MDAs, that is the starting point. Okay? And the best practice now is that the budget circular should be so comprehensive. Even all this argument about, this is the price we are going to use for oil and everything, will be part of the budget circular. Now, again, after that, the executive should also change the initiative as part of the management process or law to ensure that every actors or stakeholders in the budget are contacted and they discuss. Okay, of course, that's why we have this budget circular. The budget circular now is not just a simple letter. In fact, in the budget circular, you are supposed to have given enough information about the state of economy, the fiscal update, the economic update, and then all these things that we argue about, the oil price and everything, this is what we are going. All those things should be part of the budget circular. Really, very, very comprehensive document. It will be sent to every MDA, even to the legislature. The legislative budget office will have one. The legislature should also have. Now, from there, then there should be a process of negotiation. All right. In fact, all the stakeholders should be showing that what we call civil society input into the budget should be sought. And the legislature is part of the stakeholders. Even trade unions is part of the stakeholders. And we have done a sort of an aberration where each year we just have this Nigerian Economic Summit as if they represent everybody. All right? Nigerian Economic Summit is also a stakeholder, but they represent some interest groups. I've never seen the executive liaising or calling the trade unions or whatever, the labor segment, to hear their views about the budget. The market women, every segment should be contacted. That is the civil society input. They are supposed to make representation. They are supposed to input into the budget process if we want good governance. From there, the budget office now collates all this information and presents presents in a budget. The MDAs can come about and then defend what has been done, and that's why they talk about budget envelopes. Every MDA is given, look, this is the amount you can have. Do whatever you like. Give us the projects you want to do, the capital expenditure and what have you, and you send it back. So, you have what we call budget envelopes. It's like giving everybody, look, I have 1,000 naira. A, we should have 20 naira.